Good morning, everyone. My name is Tania Mejia-O'Donnell, and I'm a PhD student at the Prisons Research Center within the Institute of Criminology. Today, I will be speaking about women's imprisonment in the United States and how females' experiences differ from men's experiences. Many people are aware that the US leads the world in incarceration rates, making up 25% of the incarcerated population while only having 5% of the world's population. Typically, when people think of mass incarceration and prisons, images of men come to mind. What many people fail to realize is that the US also leads the nation in female incarcerated population. The US makes up 4% of the world's female population, but incarcerates 30% of it. As you can see, this puts us way ahead of many countries. This is historically unprecedented and has not always been the case. The rise in women's incarceration could be traced back to President Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs. The war on drugs introduced punitive drug policies such as mandatory minimums for drug possession and drug conspiracy charges. Essentially, what mandatory minimums did, they got rid of judicial discretion, and previously considered mitigating factors were eliminated. Women of color were disproportionately impacted by these policies. And in this graph, you could see the sharp increase in females incarceration population. There are several factors that make women's imprisonment different than men's imprisonment, and we can start even before women are entering prison. The pathways to prison for females look very different than men's. Many women are committing property and drug offenses. If they are committing violent offenses, these tend to be related to intimate partner violence or as acts of self-defense. Women are entering prisons with higher rates of trauma, mental health issues, substance use issues than their male counterparts. They are also entering prison at higher rates of undereducation, underemployment, and unemployment. Once in prison, the prison environment could be described as one of constant re-traumatization. This isn't to say that prison is not traumatizing for men, but it is to say that there are certain environmental triggers that are more particular for women. So, for example, many of the correctional officers in prisons are male. These are the same male officers that are in charge of monitoring and supervising the women in prison. They're the same male officers who are responsible for watching them as they're showering, as they're using the toilet, as they're going about their day-to-day activities. They're also the same male officers who are responsible for conducting pat-downs and strip searches, and the same male officers that engage in sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and rape. Once there are other factors that make the prison environment particularly traumatizing for women. There's a lot of loud noises, there's very small confined spaces. Another factor that makes women's imprisonment different than men's is that many of the women in prisons are mothers. It's estimated that 80% of them have children, and many of them were the primary caretaker before entering prison. It's estimated that 5 million children in the US have had an incarcerated parent. That translates to 7% of the US population, or 1 in 14 Americans. I actually fall within this statistic. My mother was sent to prison when I was 2 years old. Parental incarceration definitely creates a domino effect, and it could be described as a shared sentence. Having a parent in prison is both a stressful and traumatic experience for the mother and for the child. It impacts their overall well-being. For the child, this could impact their school performance and the level of education they receive. Children with a parent in prison are also more likely to end up involved in the criminal justice system themselves, which unfortunately creates a vicious cycle of generational incarceration. The parent-child relation is also impacted by incarceration. It is extremely difficult to maintain contact with a loved one while they are in prison. In the US, many prisons are in rural locations, and since there are fewer women's prisons, this means that they tend to be housed further away than their children, with an average of them being 200 to 300 miles away from where their child is currently at. Depending on the offense type and length of sentence, the mother may have to relinquish rights, at which point the child becomes custody of the state and enters the foster care system. Another factor that makes women's imprisonment different than men's imprisonment is that women are entering prisons pregnant. So 4% of the women are entering pregnant. Once in prison, they're receiving little to no prenatal care and reproductive care. In many states, it's still routine practice to shackle women during labor and delivery. And after birth, the baby is usually removed from the mother within 48 to 72 hours, at which point they're either turned over to a relative, or if there's no relative available, the child becomes custody of the state. Since these issues have been growing, some prisons have created prison nurseries. There's 8 states which currently have prison nurseries, and these are incentivized programs for women to keep their baby with them from anywhere from a few months up until the age of 3. As is evident, there are a number of factors that make women's imprisonment particularly different than men's imprisonment. There is still a large debate about how much equality under the law there should be, how much should gender be accounted for during sentencing and in prison policy development. Some people have called for us to reimagine prisons, other people have called for us to abolish prisons. Moving forward, what we do urgently need are diversion programs and community resources, gender informed services, harm reduction strategies, trauma informed care, solutions and strategies that prevent women from entering prison, that are addressing their needs while they are incarcerated and are helping them as they transition back into society. It is important to note that while today I spoke about women's imprisonment in the US and that the US does have very high numbers and is unique in that case, it's important to recognize that the growth in women's incarceration is a global problem. Across the world, we're seeing a growth in the number of women behind bars. For instance, this past week, the Ministry of Justice announced that they will be adding 500 prison bed spaces for women. It is important for us to get involved. We could do this through our activism, our advocacy, through voting. Most importantly, I think it's important for us to change our minds and our hearts. When it comes to criminal justice issues, it's very easy for it to be an us versus them. However, it's important to recognize that they are members of the community. Several of the matters I discussed today could be further looked into. I'm going to leave you with a list of recommended reading books. All these books discuss these issues at greater length.